Today we're going to be looking at Series 1 of Hazbin Hotel, discussing it in relation to hierarchy, reformist versus revolutionary politics and tactics, and power and autonomy in relation to sex work and harm reduction. Spoilers for all of Season 1 of Hazbin Hotel, and content warning for discussion of genocidal structures, abuse, and whorephobia. Hazbin Hotel follows Charlie Morningstar, the daughter of the fallen angel Lucifer and rebellious first woman Lilith. In a world where things have roughly gone down in the same way as the biblical story, with Lucifer being cast out of heaven into hell. Angels of heaven have decided that an uprising from hell is a constant threat to heaven and must be contained by periodically exterminating enough souls from hell that it is never a possibility for them to rise up against them. Charlie, as the princess of hell, sees the extermination happen each year, with angels from heaven brutally murdering the people of hell on the streets. Hell in this universe is largely an urban cityscape, and understands this unfairness as something that she needs to challenge for her people. She resolves to do so by opening the Hazbin Hotel, with the aim of rehabilitating sinners to show that they can change to be allowed into heaven instead of being exterminated. By the first episode setting out this premise, I was so excited by the idea that this reformist dream would quickly be shattered, and that Charlie would start off playing by the rules of the dominant ideology, particularly because of her age and privilege of being a princess, but quickly realised that the entire system is wholly and irreparably unfair, and that a different, more radical solution would be needed. This seemed to be starting to take shape when Charlie meets with the angels, including Adam, who is head of the extermination squad, and they don't listen to her ideas and instead bring forward the next extermination date by 6 months. But Charlie isn't deterred by this, or unfortunately any time that her singular idea to reform the people of hell is shown to be unworkable, continuing to push through the designated channels. On a systemic level, Charlie is the next in line to be the leader of an oppressed society who has been conditioned to view this oppression as natural and just in some way. Charlie believes that the extermination can be ended through assimilating hell citizens into heaven's norms and values by allowing those who live in hell to be made better so that they would deserve to live in heaven, thereby rendering them not a threat to heaven because they have already been assimilated and won't rise up violently like heaven believes they might. This leaves the idea of heaven and hell as a concept completely unchallenged. On an individual level, this means that Charlie has a tendency to push her privilege and reformist ideology onto those around her, generally folks who have decided to give living at the hotel a try, with the choice here being to try to be good in Charlie's rehabilitation program in the hopes of being allowed into heaven, or to risk being exterminated in 6 months' time. A great example of this is her interactions with Angel Dust, who is living at the hotel but in the beginning is labelled as someone who is not really trying to change. He is a drug user and a sex worker and is often derided and shamed for his choices, despite Angel seeming to be a self-assured, sex-positive person who is proud of his work, showing his friends at the hotel one of the films he starred in as a porn star, much to the outward disgust of most of the others at the hotel, and labelling himself an actor when the hotel bartender Husk continues jibing Angel that he is fake. The unequal power relations between Charlie and the folks that she is trying to save is also seen really clearly when Charlie goes to a film set that Angel is working on, despite Angel asking her not to try to get him more time to work on his own salvation instead of his job. Charlie is a princess who feels like everyone in hell is symbolically her people, but her privilege and lack of ability to get out of hierarchical headspace of thinking of herself as a preordained leader who needs to save everyone means that she is incapable of understanding the basic concept that Angel is at work and needs to be for his own survival, and that her intervention in that is not helpful, and in fact causes Angel to be punished by his physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive boss, Valentina. Here I feel like I need to break away a little to address Angel as a character, as it has been stated a lot that he is based on a lot of stereotypes that can be harmful, particularly in relation to him being queer, a sex worker, and a drug user, and how these combinations play off one another to create a character that brings together a lot of tropes seen in media about characters with these labels. At first, I was really pleased and relieved to be seeing a character who worked as a sex worker consensually, took pride in his work, and seemed confident in who he was. I think that this basis of Angel coming across as willing to defend himself against the attacks of others, considering him to be in some way lesser than because of who he is, makes him a really likable character despite a lot of the tropes, and made his portrayal more complicated when introducing the abusive elements in his life. Usually, when seeing a sex worker character in media being beaten up by their boss/pimp character, I sigh and resign myself to the fact that we just aren't there yet with representation. There is still such a conflation of consensual sex work with trafficking and abuse. But with Angel, he has already made it so clear in his words and actions previously that he enjoys sex work, and that the only way to undermine that is to suggest that Angel does not have autonomy and does not know his own mind, that he's lying, or that his story is just so tragic as to render his thoughts on his own situation wrong or dismissible. See a lot of nuance and complication in Angel's story because his relationship to sex work and his own sexuality can be positive. For example, seen in the fact that Angel's answer to what would build trust between the friends at the hotel is to suggest BDSM as something that requires absolute trust, while also acknowledging that the power dynamic of his relationship with Valentino specifically is abusive, both on an interpersonal level, a professional level, and the more esoteric spiritual level of the show, being his overlord who literally owns Angel's soul. I would say that the song Poison comes the closest to fetishizing and victim blaming to do with Angel's abusive relationship, with lyrics like, I should have known that this would happen. The worst part of this hell, I can only blame myself. I made my choices, and my story's gonna end with me dead from your poison. But perhaps a read not reliant on tropes of sex workers in media is that this is Angel internalizing these ideas about himself and believing the worst that other people think of him at a very low point in his abuse. It also cuts between scenes of Angel looking in control and scenes where Angel is being genuinely abused, or scenes where Angel is doing BDSM porn scenes with the visuals making it difficult to distinguish between consent and non-consent, and visually giving the idea that Angel is projecting fake strength and confidence in comparison to looking powerless. A lot of this plays into swerve, sex worker exclusionary, radical feminist ideology, and not trusting sex workers to communicate their experiences accurately if it doesn't coincide with seeing them as purely a victim of the industry. Angel comes across as so self possessed that I think he seems strong in everything he does despite his flaws. And it's cathartic to see him stand up to his abuser later in the series, even though he is punished for doing so. To me, Angel's character brings up a lot of thoughts to do with liberatory harm reduction and the idea that people need to be able to make their own choices on how they survive difficult situations without the judgment of others around them, that label certain coping or survival strategies as unhealthy. As some examples in that, that would be sex work and drug use for Angel specifically. Because the show has a framework that doesn't seem to really deliberately challenge mainstream ideas of drug use and consent, Angel's friends often don't seem to support him for making the choices that he needs to make currently to survive the material situation that he is in, falling back on ideas that sobriety equals good, promiscuity equals damage, and not really taking into account the wider backdrop of anyone's behaviours and why anyone would be labelled unfavourably for making these choices when already confined to hell for an eternity for some perceived lack of goodness. This functions in much the same way that survival crimes like drug use, theft, sex work, etc., are demonized within our own society, individualizing the behaviors rather than understanding them as taking place within a society based on control and needing an underclass, like how heaven needs hell to exist in this way, but similarly doesn't want hell to become uncontrollable. The line in the song Poison, I got so good at telling you what you want to hear, I dissociate, disappear, made me think of Barbie Wilder's essay on neurodivergence and sex work, which I will link in the description, talking about her experiences as a sex worker and how she views dissociation as a skill in her job, while other people mistakenly conflate that with sex work being traumatic. There is a lot of reality to Angel's character and experiences, but it needs to be viewed with a lot more nuance than if you're reading him according to usual stereotyping of sex workers. Because Angel is experiencing many different elements of trauma, and conflating that with his involvement in sex work in general oversimplifies his story and reactions and fails to see him as a fully realized three-dimensional character. Reading Angel's reactions, it is necessary to understand the underpinning that sex work is labour, and labour in any job is exploitative. Sex work is not uniquely so. Within the narrative, Husk creates a lot of tension with Angel by rejecting who Angel is, always saying that he is fake, rejecting his advances, and often in a way that comes across as toxically masculine and somewhat homophobic. Not quite. Until they develop a friendship that seems to be based on finding that Angel has more to him than Husk had first considered. It's only at this point that it feels as though Husk reaches out in a way that Angel can relate to, dancing with one another in the song Loser Baby, with Husk starting the line, "It's okay to be a," and Angel finishing it with, "Coked up dick sucking hoe," with such a questioning tone, but with a sense of hope of acceptance, that he is okay with himself in that way, but is almost disbelieving that anyone else could also be okay with. The moment that Husk replies, "Baby, that's fine by me," is when Angel spreads his arms and starts to sing along, taking the label of loser and the acceptance that is coming with that, with Angel standing underneath lots of usually negative labels to do with being a sex worker, drug user, but owning them as part of his identity. This is one of the only times that the show seems to take into account how characters feel about their own behaviours and sense of self, rather than projecting morality onto them. As the saying goes, hell is other people, and it's really true for the hell of Hazbin Hotel, since there is such an established and unchallenged hierarchy within their society. The leader of hell himself, Lucifer, Princess Charlie, the overlords who own the souls of folks in hell and have power over them, and characters lower down the hierarchy but with close enough proximity to Charlie to be given some amount of character and agency. Heaven is shown to be a place of hypocrisy. Hell is made hellish through hierarchies established by the folks who live there. Most people seem to be surviving hell through keeping their heads down, doing their jobs, and not upsetting their overlords. And it seems as though, on a personal level, we as the audience see owning the souls of others as a problem when we are treated to physically seeing the manifestations of chains around the necks of characters that we follow, but the dynamic has not been challenged systemically. Overlords, like the capitalists of our own universe, are often in competition with each other and self interested to the point of isolation from the rest of the society they live in, despite the dangers even to themselves. One overlord, Carmilla Carmine, an arms dealer, found that she was able to kill an angel during the last extermination, but keeps the information secret, not wanting to bring trouble to herself or her family, despite, or perhaps because of, how that information could change the entire landscape of hell in making people aware that it's possible to fight back and that, contrary to the popular belief, angels can be killed. Until there is absolutely no other option but to fight, and it has been revealed that fighting is not necessarily completely futile, the focus of change is based on individually reforming characters and asking institutions of power nicely if they would please consider not killing folks. As we see unfortunately playing out in real life in relation to all threats to life, and mediating rebellion through the proper channels. Have you tried a petition? By this point, I was furiously telling the screen the Master's tools will never dismantle the Master's house, and wondering when we might ever see our characters realizing that Charlie isn't actually doing anything to help the situation by always ceding power to Heaven's authority and keeping power for herself in hell, and that there needs to be a time of realizing that speaking politely with oppressors is not the only option. Charlie unfortunately keeps seeing herself as a divine leader in all of this, whose job it is to lead the masses to a revolt where she gets to dictate the terms of what is acceptable rebellion and what is not. For example, when residents of Cannibal Town agreed to join the fight against the angels and are enthusing about wanting to taste angel wings, Charlie is taking their physical support as an army while distancing herself from and dismissing their methods, asking them to tone it down and not be so violent. Here, Charlie is making a distinction between the righteous killing of self-defense, the kind that is done as a necessity in only the degree needed to fend off outright genocidal attack, and killing as an uprising or as vengeance. Charlie wants for the cannibals to kill and potentially die on her behalf, but doesn't want to lose the moral high ground as she sees it by condoning violence, even when it is against a force that has been one-sidedly attacking and killing them for thousands of years. This maps pretty neatly onto the real world in the form of peace policing, and that the dominant ideology within activist spaces at this time is definitely one of non-violence, which has taken hold of activist scenes and is pushed zealously by organizations as the only valid form of resistance, supposedly doesn't make activists look bad and detract from the cause. I can explain what the term non-violence means according to its proponents, but first I want to state that I believe its explanation to be semantic nonsense, and that its advancement is having the very real effect of hampering progress in all movements for systemic change by discouraging non-accountable direct action that would have direct results, tying activists up in lengthy and expensive court proceedings and potentially imprisoning them, and focusing more on media spectacle than actual results. According to advocates for nonviolence, nonviolence is situated as a separate alternative from violence and not being violent, not on the spectrum between these things, an entirely removed option. Violence can be defined as anything non-violence requires it to be to situate non-violence as a morally superior alternative, ranging from actual physical harm to living beings, to disorderly property damage, shaming someone, or escalating a situation in any way from means as wide as drumming, dancing, or raising your voice. When this is the range that can be violence, it's like all words have lost all meaning. Non-violence, on the other hand, is the righteous and controlled alternative to violence and can be entirely dependent on your conduct. An example given by non-violence advocates in this would be that smashing a pump at a petrol station and fleeing would be an act of violence, whereas decommissioning a pump at a petrol station and waiting to be arrested would be non-violence. Methodically, smashing a bank window with a hammer and waiting to be arrested would be non-violence, but using a brick and getting away with it would be violence, even if it's the same window. Hopefully these examples start to illustrate how the effect of something can be the same, but non-violence has a preoccupation with creating martyrs for the cause and dictating how things should be done in relation to how they will be perceived from the outside, rather than what will be the most effective in achieving our aims. My introduction to nonviolence was reading the book The Failure of Nonviolence by Peter Gelderloos, which is available for free on the anarchistlibrary.org. I'll put a link in the description. And it puts forward the idea that defining actions according to whether they are violent or not violent, peaceful or not peaceful, is an exercise in meaningless semantics. Also, that it allows bad actors, like the media, to frame struggles in this way, shifting attention from whether the effect of an action is liberatory or not, and easily creating categories like the good, peaceful protesters and the bad outside agitators who want to employ a diversity of tactics that is incompatible with the fragile, non-violent container. The concept of non-violence in the real world does not acknowledge state violence as violence. The police have a monopoly on violence, that wage slavery is a form of violence, that allowing people to starve while companies throw out food and mix it with bleach in their bins is a form of violence. These forms of violence are invisible and expected as a normal part of how our society functions, while individual acts responding to this treatment are seen as actual violence. In the process of social change, there will be violence, but proponents of non-violence want for all of that violence to be directed from the state onto activists that need to passively withstand these assaults as though they can create enough sympathy for the state to change course. Non-violence training will literally teach you that you have to cut your fingernails so you don't accidentally scratch the cops as they drag you into the back of a police van, or which side to fall on to protect your vital organs from someone beating you, because even to defend yourself would be a form of violence. Let's sink in for a second. Anyway, ideologically, it's much the same going on in the world of Hazbin Hotel. At no point do any of the characters really reckon with the idea that it may be necessary in the face of genocidal violence to mount actual resistance beyond defending inevitable exterminations, or to challenge the systems that are causing this to happen, even if it means violent rebellion, and that this is all justified. Instead, they tend to stick to working through the proper channels of dialogue by negotiating with an occupying force that has complete power over them, allowing heaven to dictate the underlying terms of morality, using heaven's court system despite it obviously being created by and functioning to maintain heaven's authority, and pushing values of reform and mercy even when it directly endangers the people of hell. It's the equivalent of in the real world how you start with a petition, realize that that's not doing anything, and so instead you fight the system using that system's own logic and institutions, which is exactly what nonviolence wants you to do. Go to a protest to show your dissent, but be super peaceful. Don't shout any chants with naughty words or get too angry. Don't wear a mask to protect yourself from police surveillance. That might be scary and make us activists look bad. Whatever you do, definitely don't take direct action and get away with it. It's actually violent to do that because you need to hand yourself over to the police so they can take away your freedom, collect your data, and drag you through the court system that's all designed to uphold the authority of the state. Ultimately, don't even really imagine that you can really change anything systemically about the world that you live in. We can beg the people in charge to make little incremental changes that don't give up any of their power or privilege, but mostly things need to stay as they are because to disrupt the status quo too much is also in itself violence. Obviously, the logic of Hazbin Hotel conforms to this, and just as with non-violence, keeps repeating the same fruitless steps working within a system that will never allow for freedom or justice. The characters are always playing within the limits that heaven has set out. The idea that heaven needs to prevent an uprising from hell is also respected in that Charlie wants the sinners of hell to be judged as not a threat to heaven because of changing them to assimilate to heaven's values instead, rather than owning their power and challenging the structures that put heaven in control and allow them to inflict violence on them. When the angels come to exterminate the citizens of hell, Charlie's forces have trained enough to kill many of them, although Charlie is unable to best Adam, and it is only by the leader of hell himself showing up that saves Charlie, which I thought was a really disappointing message in terms of hierarchy, patriarchy, and just unsatisfying storytelling by centering a character and relationship with less weight given to it. I think it would have been a lot more cathartic to see Charlie's girlfriend Baggy take on this role to help Charlie, considering her arc as an angel turning on other angels, it being personally a big achievement for her to fight Adam, who has been trying to blackmail her, and solidifying her relationship with Charlie even further in repairing the damage of her lying about being an angel. Even at this point, Vaggie, Charlie, and Lucifer are all preaching and practicing mercy where they are able to spare individual angels who have been presented as characters. It's only a misunderstanding where Nifty has been told to stab any angels she sees that leads to her stabbing Adam in the back and killing him after the other characters have concluded on showing him mercy, allowing Charlie and her friends to still keep playing into a type of morality of not wanting to kill forces that have literally been sent there to exterminate them all. The battle ends with the angelic forces being warded off, with one of our main characters, Serpentius, having sacrificed himself earlier in the fight to try to kill Adam, but failing. Even with this loss, and the only victory that they could really hope to achieve being to show enough force that heaven does not try these tactics again, mercy is seen as a virtue, and Charlie is seen in the ruins of the hotel in the throes of self-pity. She should have done better at convincing heaven, and then none of this bloodshed would have ever happened. Charlie absolutely misses the point that this occupying and murderous force is the problem in this, not showing active resistance to it. She still sees herself as a leader, despite that she is often not as helpful at direct action tactics like combat than her friends, and doesn't seem to ever start to place herself as part of a group or dismantle the hierarchy that has her at the top. She is surrounded by yes people who keep telling her that this is all her destiny, and everyone starts to rebuild the hotel from the ruins, still clinging to the fantasy that individual reform is the way forward rather than challenging the systemic problems and authority. This is even after experiencing violent direct combat, because it is all framed as self-defense rather than considering that hell could and should have an uprising that completely throws off the authority and value judgments of heaven and reorganizes their own society to make hell not punishment for the folks that live there. There is no one in hell that is orchestrating the will that hell should be a terrible place to live, only selfish and authoritarian power relations put in place by those who want to seize power. Despite not having mentioned Alistar, the radio demon, before this point, I feel like I have to mention that when Alistair is saying that he wants freedom towards the end of the last episode in the series, I momentarily was there with him. I was finally resonating with someone who I believed was understanding they needed to throw off the chains of every aspect of heaven and hell and hierarchy, until realizing that Alistair just has authoritarian machinations and wants individual freedom for himself, with that equating to him being at the top of the pile instead. It led me to realizing that heaven is full of bad guys, but hell is also not the inverse of this, and is unfortunately not on the edge of an anarchist revolution either. Everyone, even the characters I think we're supposed to like, are so invested in their own power and authority that hell isn't ready to show heaven that it could be a utopia for the damned. No one in Hazbin Hotel seems to want genuine freedom, despite the oppressions involved systemically and individually throughout the whole series, and it leaves me confused about why. I really enjoyed the world building and the characters in this series, but I was so certain that it was going to tell a story of liberation over assimilation and coming to the realization that revolution achieves things that reform just can't, and that in many circumstances, continuing to try to reform something in the face of this level of oppression and danger harms everyone. Because of the lens that I see things through, I would love to see Charlie meaningfully recognize, confront, and dismantle her own privilege and power, starting to see herself as a member of a group rather than the leader of it, and for the masses to rise against the overlords in hell as well as the angels in heaven, with the understanding that this kind of uprising is justified and doesn't need to be softened. I hope to see the citizens of hell rejecting labels of goodness or badness and living according to their own sense of justice and freedom with no rulers, and creating a society where hell isn't a punishment, a community that can fly in the face of heaven as a force that wanted to crush it and see it fail. Those were my thoughts on series 1 of Hazbin Hotel. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments, and see you in the next one. I can't quote the lyrics. The fact that they're so rude and they rhyme. It's too much.